Final Fantasy X-2 is a game that people either love or love to hate. While its gameplay is often praised for being one of the most fun iterations of the ATB system, critics will often criticize its unnecessary story, and how it more or less undid the beautiful endings of Final Fantasy X. And personally, I'm somewhere in between, as I think Final Fantasy X-2 was an incredibly fun game, although as a follow-up to X's story, I'm not sure how I feel about it. But director of Final Fantasy X-2 Motomu Toriyama does not want the story to end there. And that's right, Lightning's husband wants Final Fantasy X-3 to come to fruition. But it's not just him, it's also the Zipper King himself, Tetsuya Nomura. Now, this may sound vaguely familiar, as we've heard from Yoshinori Kitase, the game's original director and producer of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Shinji Hashimoto, on quite a number of occasions that they want to make Final Fantasy X-3 happen. This is the longest I have ever seen the company talk about a game without actually developing it until, well, they finally developed Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's quite clear that across the board, Creative Business Unit 1 wants to make Final Fantasy X-3 come to reality. And now, in addition to those comments, we now have ones from Motomu Toriyama and even Tetsuya Nomura. In an interview with Famitsu, as translated by an RPG site, Nomura said, quote, "If we are to make Final Fantasy X-3, we somehow have a synopsis written by Final Fantasy X writer Kazushige Nojima. It's sleeping right now, but the plot itself does exist. For anyone who keeps up with Final Fantasy X's universe, this of course makes sense. Both the audio drama Will, included on Final Fantasy X 10-2 HD Remaster, as well as the rather infamous Final Fantasy X 2.5. Good lord, that book is cursed. They seem to already have a plan in place. At the end of the audio drama Will, it's more or less spelled out that Sin has returned, and Yuna is once again tasked with defeating him. This does make things complicated, as a number of people absolutely hated the audio drama, as well as the book, which features Tidus's head exploding due to getting kicked by a blitzball, and then he comes back to life. I wish I was making this up. I'm totally not making this up. This actually happens in the book. His head literally, I don't know what Nojima was thinking when he wrote this. Anyway, you may be thinking that because this was poorly received that it probably wouldn't make its way into Final Fantasy X-3. Come on, they'll come up with something new. Has a piece of content being poorly received ever stopped them from using it in canon? And the answer is no. However, there is a roadblock in starting the development on Final Fantasy X-3, and if you're familiar with what Creative Business Unit 1 is already working on, then you know exactly what it is. With Toriyama saying, quote, "The probability is not zero. We are not in a phase where we can talk about it unless we are finished producing Final Fantasy VII Remake. All the staff who worked on Final Fantasy X and X-2, who Square would undoubtedly want to work on Final Fantasy X-3, are currently busy working on Final Fantasy VII Remake. All the key staff, including Motomu Toriyama, Kazushige Nojima, Tetsuya Nomura, Motomu Toriyama, they're all working on Final Fantasy VII Remake." And this sentiment has also been echoed by Yoshinori Kitase and Shinji Hashimoto in the past. Final Fantasy X-3 is absolutely going to happen, but it cannot until Final Fantasy VII Remake is wrapped up. I legitimately cannot see Final Fantasy VII Remake finishing anytime soon. The series being a trilogy at this point is looking increasingly less likely to me. It's entirely possible that this could really go on for 4 games. And if that's the case, we wouldn't be seeing Final Fantasy X-3 for almost another decade. It's no surprise to me that they want to continue Final Fantasy X. It's one of the most popular games in the Final Fantasy series, and in Japan, it might actually be the most popular Final Fantasy, with a recent NHK poll showing that Final Fantasy X even beats out Final Fantasy VII there. For this reason, there's no wonder they want to follow this game up. And while Final Fantasy X-2's story has ended as wholesome as one could possibly imagine, it's really hard to imagine what Final Fantasy X-3 can even add at this point. But as a massive fan of Final Fantasy X, I'll give it a chance. But with that said, Ultima, I want to hear from you. Would you be excited for Final Fantasy X-3? Subscribe, hit that bell icon, and let me know in the comments below. Shout out to patron Jimmy Jerez and the rest of the Ultima community.
強いふり時を戻して怒ればよ てないよ